Hi everybody. So here's our second video lecture. Before I start, just let me express again my thanks for your patience in all of this. Some of these opportunities and things that have called me away have just prevented me from being in the classroom with you, and I'm sorry about that. But I hope that these video lectures can help keep us on track with the syllabus, and we will make sure that in Thursday's class that we spend a little bit of time at the outset of the lecture addressing any questions that might have come up for you in listening to this lecture. Additionally, please feel free to send me any emails that you might have or come up for you if you want to talk about this material or anything else in the class. Before Thursday, I will do my very best to respond to you during that time, though I will be in transit on Wednesday, 12-hour flight back to Toronto from Hawaii. Okay, so let's dive in. In the last class before reading week, we saw Nagarjuna's arguments about dependent origination and svabhava. And this provides a kind of background condition against which we can evaluate some of the claims that he's going to make about, in today's class, what we're going to read about is the self and the Tathāgata, the Buddha. So today is also the due date for your second writing assignment. So please upload that to the course website before the end of today's lecture. I believe I have the timer there set for 2 p.m. so that will be the time after which the paper will be graded as late. So I'm looking forward to reading those, and I'll get started on those just as soon as I get back into the country. Okay, so let's dive in with a small, quick review of the different kinds of ways that Buddhist philosophers have gone about negating the reality of the self. So far we've looked at 3 of these in some detail. That was what we might call the soteriological strategy route. That's the idea that it is skillful to cultivate an attitude towards one's own experience such that we do not regard the continuity of our mental life as constituting a self. But in having a soteriological strategy of not selfing, we have not yet committed to the view that there is in fact no self. And part of the reason that some Buddhists can be interpreted as taking this view is because there, as we've seen in some of the discourses we looked at earlier in the course, we've seen that sometimes the Buddha is very skeptical about making any kind of existence claims. It seems that there is at least some thread in the Pali discourses that we've analyzed where the Buddha is very reluctant or even hostile towards the idea that we can formulate views about what ultimately exists or does not exist. And therefore, to interpret the anatta teaching as a view that there is in fact no self would be to make an error by committing to an existence claim, rather than to be cultivating a practical path of action that leads from dukkha to moksha, or liberation. So that's the soteriological strategy that can be, I think, coherently applied to some of the early discourses, though not all of them. The second, more common version of this view is the Abhidharmika view that we saw typified very precisely by the work of Vasubandhu, at least Vasubandhu in his Abhidharmika stage. In the weeks that follow, we'll have an opportunity to look at what Vasubandhu's view evolves into as a Yogacara thinker, and that is a very interesting transformation that we'll take some time with when the time comes. So that view, the Abhidharmika view, is the view that we can reduce or reductively analyze the purported existence of a composite whole, like a self, and we can analyze that self away in terms of the fluctuating momentary causal arisings and passings away of momentary, mental, and physical events, which are called dharmas. Then, third, we had the Pudgalavadan view, which, like all Buddhist views, denies the existence of an Atman, but affirms the reality of a Pudgala, or a person, on the grounds that we have to think of ourselves as Pudgala. Otherwise, we cannot make sense of certain core features of the Buddha's view, namely the feature of there being karmic continuity in the past life. So there's a relationship to the past that requires the Pudgala. Then, without the Pudgalavadan claims we cannot make sense of appropriation in the present moment, the way in which the aggregates are appropriated. We need a Pudgala to explain that. And finally, we need a Pudgala to explain future cessation, the end of the path, the culmination of practice with the realization of nirvana. That also requires an understanding of a Pudgala in order to make sense. So claims the Pudgalavadan. So those are the three views of not-self that we've looked at so far. Now, the Madhyamaka view is very interesting because I've called it here on your handout, emptiness without intrinsic identity. And the idea here is that instead of trying to reductively analyze composite wholes down into a more fundamental substratum of actually existing entities, however momentary, however fluctuating, instead, what the Madhyamika tries to do, their strategy, is to claim that the self, or Atman, along with every other particular aspect of reality that might seem to exist in and of itself, as it is on its own side, that all of those entities, the self included, are empty, or sunya, empty of intrinsic nature or substance, svabhava. So this is a different approach because it sees all phenomena, either objective or subjective, as being empty of this same phenomena. And because the basic existence that we're looking at are empty of svabhava, it makes no sense to affirm that they ultimately exist, because they don't have any basis upon which to exist as they are in themselves. And so the negation of self is deeply tied up with the negation of the object as well. And we'll see that that is not a nihilistic view. It is a very subtle view about how conventional reality structures things, or our conventional ways of thinking about reality structure reality for us. So let's dive in to the first couple of verses of this chapter. Okay, so the question that I have here on your handout, and this is a question that you will be looking at in your second writing assignment, is what might it mean to claim that the self is empty of svabhava? So here's what Nagarjuna has to say in the opening verses of chapter 18. He says, if the self were the skandhas, it would participate in coming to be and passing away. If it were something other than the skandhas, it will be something having the defining characteristic of a non-skandha. So, regarding these first two verses, we see a denial of an identity between the self and the aggregates. Why? Why would Nagarjuna want to deny this? Well, at the top of the second page here, I've formulated that part of the verse into an argument. Here's how the argument goes. The first premise is that, one, the aggregates are by definition fluctuating every moment. They are impermanent, momentary. But if the self were identical with the aggregates, then the self would be fluctuating every moment. That would be the consequence of the self being identical with the aggregates, given that the aggregates have this particular nature. Now, the self, third premise, is by definition that which stays the same across time, such that we remain the same person now that we were in the past and that we will be in the future. That's just what we mean by a self, is the part of us that stays the same across momentary changes in our experience. But if that's so, it therefore follows that anything that is fluctuating every moment cannot be the self. Therefore, the aggregates cannot be the self. So that's the first verse. That's the argument that we have there. Now, here's where things get tricky. Because for reasons very similar to those offered by Vasubandhu in a previous lecture that we had, we also can't affirm the reality of the self as something separate from the skandhas either. That won't work either. Why? Well, here's the argument for the second part of this first verse, okay? It goes like this. For X to be defined as distinct from Y, for the self to be defined as distinct from the aggregates, X must have a defining characteristic that makes X equal to itself and not equal to Y. But if the self had such a characteristic, then it would be different from the skandhas. But if the self were different from the skandhas, this would be to abandon the Buddha's teaching. Right? Because the Buddha does not anywhere claim that there is some self separate from the skandhas. Everywhere the Buddha claims that what we mean when we analyze the processes of subjectivity, we refer to the aggregates. So, therefore, the self cannot be defined apart from the aggregates. Now here's the thing to note. Two notes I've got here at this bottom of this page of this handout. The first note is that non-Buddhist schools would be very happy to embrace the third premise, right? They would bite the bullet and say, all right, well then let's abandon the Buddha's teaching. So because that this is part of the logic of the argument, it's important to note that the target for this argument is Buddhists, not non-Buddhists. The main target here, the main overlap here in this part that might be reminding you of something we've dealt with in the past is the way the Pudgalavadins approach this issue. So here on the second note I have, recall that the Pudgalavadins embrace the idea that the Pudgala could be thought of as something that is neither reducible to nor rightfully thought of as separate from the aggregates. The Madhyamaka might seem to be making a similar claim here in denying that we can think of the self as being identical with the aggregates nor as entirely separate from them. But the point is a little bit different, because in the background of these negations for Nagarjuna is this view that nothing has svabhava. Right? So the Pudgalavadins, in fact, affirm the existence of an inexplicable entity called the Pudgala. Nagarjuna makes no such move. He simply says, it doesn't make sense to say that the self is identical with the aggregates, and it doesn't make sense to say that the self is not identical with the aggregates. Why? Because to make either of those claims would be to give the self a svabhava that it couldn't possibly hold. Because if it had the svabhava of the aggregates, then it wouldn't be a self. And if it had the svabhava of being otherwise than the aggregates, then all of the reasoning that we saw from Vasubandhu about the self being able to interact with the aggregates, to have any role at all in an understanding of how the mind works, that would all fall away, and the entire edifice of the Buddhist framework would fall away. So, for these reasons, Nagarjuna is going to remain silent where the Pudgalavadins were quite vocal about affirming the existence of an entity that exists somewhere between the aggregates and being different from them, whereas Nagarjuna makes no such claim. Okay. So let's take a quick look now at the second verse of chapter 18, which goes like this. The self not existing, how will there be what belongs to self? There is no mine and no I because of the cessation of self, and that which pertains to the self. So, a couple things to note about this passage. Okay, the first is that the verse is attempting to infer the non-existence of the aggregates as that which is appropriated by the self. The aggregates are what's appropriated, the self is what appropriates. It's trying to negate or infer the non-existence of the aggregates as that which is appropriated by a self, on the basis of the non-existence of the self, or that which appropriates. So if there isn't an appropriator, then there isn't something that's appropriated. Now that isn't to deny that the aggregates exist, it's simply to deny that the aggregates ultimately exist as appropriated aggregates. So, again, we run up against an exegetical puzzle that we have to keep in mind, because recall that Nagarjuna is holding himself to a very terse and tight verse meter, which causes his constructions to be very, very tight and condensed. And so it's very, very easy to fall into the habit of reading Nagarjuna in a nihilistic way. So, for example, here at the top of page 3 of your handout, I note that when reading Nagarjuna's negative claims about existence, such as the verse where he claims that the self is not existing, he is not, and indeed can't be saying that ultimately the self does not exist. Why is that? Because were he to make that claim, he would be committed to metaphysical nihilism. Or at least nihilism about the self. And other Buddhists, for example, Vasubandhu, Abhidharmika Buddhists like Vasubandhu, they can help themselves to such a reductive metaphysics. They're happy to say, no, there is no self, there's just the dharmas. But that's not what Vasubandhu, or that's not what Nagarjuna is on about. That's not his project here. Why? Because to say something ultimately does not exist would be to commit oneself to an ultimate truth, which contradicts the claims that all is empty of svabhava. So to say that the self ultimately exists is logically equivalent to saying that the self ultimately doesn't exist, because both views have an ultimate claim about what is or is not the case. And that kind of affirmation and negation is precisely the kind of reified metaphysical speculation that Nagarjuna's Madhyamaka is designed to counteract. So when you're reading these verses and you see these negations, understand that the negation has a very narrow scope. It's not a metaphysical negation. It is not a negation of it's not an ultimate negation. It is simply saying whenever you say the self does not exist, it means the self does not ultimately exist. Or the aggregates do not exist, the aggregates do not ultimately exist, as appropriated. Things that exist in virtue of conventional understanding. And the ultimate truth is to recognize that fact in every convention so that you do not become attached to the conventions, because conventions present themselves to us as if they were ultimately real. And that is what causes the mind to latch on and to cling to the world. So, this is where the connection between the Buddhist view that in some way or another there is not a self, where that view starts to converge very explicitly with soteriological aims, with a philosophical psychology that is designed to emancipate the individual from misery. And Nagarjuna is no different than any other Buddhist in this regard, and that's why we'll see in the verses that follow, the ones we've just read through, a decided shift in tone to how the story about the self being empty of svabhava has an intimate connection to the Buddhist liberative project, liberation from the miseries of samsaric existence. So, let's take a look at verse 4. In verse 4 it says, and this is on page 197 of the translation you have. On verse 4 we have the following. The senses of mind and eye, based on the outer and the inner being lost, appropriation is extinguished. Because of losing that, there is the cessation of birth. So this verse is something that all Buddhists can get behind. Right? The idea here is that once we stop appropriating the elements of existence and experience, all sense of those things being mine or I subside. And that subsiding is coextensive with liberation from ignorance and craving, which is nirvana. Now here in the next verse, verse 5, this is where things get really interesting, because we see the particular flavor of Nagarjuna's soteriological interpretation of Buddhist philosophy. So, I'm going to read verse 5 to you, and then we're going to unpack some of the key terms that get used in this verse to explicate the problem of suffering. So, verse 5 says, liberation is attained through the destruction of actions, karma, and defilements, klesha. Karma and klesha arise because of falsifying conceptualizations, vikalpa, nirvikalpa. Now, those arise, those falsifying conceptualizations, those arise from hypostatization. prapanchas. But hypostatization is extinguished in emptiness. Okay. So we've got a few different notions on the board here. Let's go through them all very carefully. First, karma and klesha, actions and defilements. These are the explicitly problematic behaviors and mental events that keep us miserable. Karmic accumulation is what keeps us bound to samsara. Klesha are the impurities that drive negative karmic behavior. Now, vikalpa, falsifying conceptualizations. These are thoughts which refer to the self as I and the world as mind. This is the way in which our cognition about self and world becomes encoded in the structure of self and world. Me, I and me, mine. So the world is there for me and I am the thing that it's for. Now, underneath this, we have this idea of prapancha, hypostatization, or perhaps better, conceptual proliferation. These are the cognitive acts which reify the mind and the world into substantial entities, and then we impute svabhava to them. So it's in virtue of the mind being agitated and always trying to make sense of this agitation by imposing categories on the world that we think fit absolutely and categories on the self which we think refer perfectly. And then on the basis of that, we reify the world and the subject into unchanging entities and refer to them as I and me and mine. Now, it is this progression of reification and ossification in the mind that is the primary source of dukkha for Nagarjuna. And you might note that this is actually a slightly different emphasis from the way we've seen dukkha problematized in the earlier discourses we've looked at in this course, where the affective dimension of craving is far more fundamental. But in Nagarjuna, and I think it's safe to say in Mahayana Buddhist philosophy more generally, there's a stronger emphasis on the problem of ignorance. And ignorance, rather than craving, is the main hurdle over which we need to jump in order to become emancipated. But one thing to keep in mind, just as an open philosophical and interpretive question about Buddhist philosophy, is what the right way. What is something like this? What is the right way to think about the relationship between craving, which is the second noble truth, and ignorance, and how those two connect to create this problem of dukkha for us? Now, I'm not going to tell you anything in particular about this. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I just think it's something that is worth keeping in mind, especially if you're trying to think about the relevant differences in emphasis that come up when we're exploring these different schools of Buddhist philosophy. Okay, so because this process of reification in the mind happens in different ways, the solution to this problem is very different depending on the individual. And this is what's sometimes called skillful means, or upaya, in teaching in Buddhist philosophy. And that's why in verse 6 we see a graded teaching. And the graded teaching goes like this. It is claimed that sometimes there is a self, sometimes there is no self, and sometimes there is neither self nor not self. And each of these teachings, has a specific purpose. In particular, it is sometimes taught, even in a Buddhist framework, that there is a self. Why? Because this helps people to understand the moral dimensions of the Buddhist Dharma. Namely, that there are consequences to your actions. And so sometimes it's taught that there is a self that lasts over lifetimes. And this is part of what animates the Pudgalavadan view, that we have an irreducible conceptual need to refer to ourselves as Pudgala. Why? Because the Pudgala helps us to understand the continuity of mind that exists in one lifetime and across lifetimes. And so sometimes the Buddha teaches as if there is a person or a self, in order to help the individual come to a conviction that we live in a moral universe, And that's just a basic commitment of all Buddhist philosophy, that we are in a morally realistic universe, and you may not get your moral comeuppance or your dessert in this life, but eventually you will. So that's why sometimes it's thought to be skillful to teach that there is a self. But then, as we've seen in most Buddhist schools, it's also thought to be skillful to teach that there is no self. Why? Because it helps to combat reification. We have a very deep-seated need to self-appropriate, to find the really real me deep inside, and then to grab on and hold on to it very tightly. But the Buddhist moral psychology tells us that this sort of self-grasping is just a really unskillful thing to do, because everything is impermanent. And so if you cling to anything, you're going to be disappointed. So this is why the not-self teaching is there. It is to help people overcome this deep habit of self-appropriation. And yet, this isn't the final position according to the Madhyamaka. The final position is the view that there is neither self nor not self. And this is to encourage an awareness of emptiness, or sunyata. The idea that there is no particular aspect of the world that exists independently. And therefore, what it is for something to be what it is for it to depend on other things. And this is not just merely a causal connection between between a sprout and a seed. It is a constitutional relationship. What it is to be a thing, what it is to be a self, is to be dependent on a world. What it is to be a world is to be in view of a self. And these things don't exist apart from each other. And so the idea is not that we're trying to get rid of a self, but to understand the emergence of self and world dependently, how they dependently co-emerge. And therefore, because they dependently co-emerge, they have no intrinsic being of them in and of themselves. All right. So the interesting thing about this next chapter that we're going to look at, the chapter on the Tathāgata, is Nagarjuna is concerned to really relieve the mind of any clinging that it might have. And because the Buddha is such a powerful historical and religious figure, many people cling to the Buddha. And they on account of the specialness and the cosmological significance of the Buddha's enlightenment, people turn the Buddha into something more than what he is. And so the Madhyamaka analysis offers a kind of prophylactic against this sort of tendency as well. And that's what the Tathāgata chapter is meant to illustrate. So this term, the Tathāgata, we've seen it before. The Buddha often is referred to, and indeed kind of strangely refers to himself in the third person as the Tathāgata often. This term, Tathāgata, has a couple of meanings. You can break it down into Tatha and Gata. So Tatha means thusness. Gatha means to come or go. And so literally the term has a kind of dual meaning. It means the one who has thus come or arrived, or the one who has literally thus gone to the far shore beyond suffering. So the Buddha is the one who has gone thus to the further shore beyond suffering, and the Buddha is also the one who has thus come to help teach the world to cross over from the shore of misery to the shore of nirvana. So this is a title. It's a singular title that refers only to a fully enlightened Buddha. And the Buddha, as I mentioned, on account of his singular uniqueness as a world figure, is often subjected to metaphysical questions. And we've seen a few of those in the discourses that we've read about Tathāgata, who would often ask of the Buddha what his destiny was after death and things of that sort. And so part of what the arguments in this chapter are meant to do is to counteract those sorts of tendencies of turning the Buddha into a god. And so there's what is said in this chapter is there's a five-fold denial, where it said the Buddha is not identical with the skandhas, also not distinct from them. The skandhas aren't in him like a container, and he is not in the skandhas, and he also does not possess the skandhas. Now, the question is why? Why might Nagarjuna be interested in arguing in this way? Well, here are some possible answers to think about. Okay, one is that it takes us all the way back to the readings of the Dhammapada that we did, where we saw multiple cases this idea that one who has gone beyond dukkha, one who has fully emancipated themselves, is untraceable, like a bird in the sky. Such a one cannot be reckoned with by Mara. They become invisible to the god of death. And so in this passage, in this chapter, we see Nagarjuna trying to help us understand what the invisibility might consist in. And that invisibility consists in a recognition that even the Buddha is empty of svabhava. And thus the full realization of that emptiness renders the Buddha, or anyone who has likewise achieved emancipation, inscrutable to those who parse the world in terms of those categories that have been abandoned by such liberated individuals. Categories like existence and non-existence. The second possible answer is that the propensity of beings to reify things is very, very deep. We cling and we apply categories with great force to the world to try and create sense and meaning out of it. And this is one of the major habits that Buddhist philosophy is trying to help us get through, overcome. So when a person like the Buddha becomes a religious authority by achieving something spiritual, the propensity to conceive of that individual as a special kind of thing is natural for those who come to follow such a person. However, those very conceptions, the specialness of the Buddha, can re-entrench those very forms of cognitive reification that the Buddha is trying to help people escape from. So in this chapter, what we see is this attempt to situate the Buddha within this pragmatic anti-metaphysical framework to help the individual avoid the problems of reification that come when you turn the things that you're encountering in the world into absolute entities that have their own substance or intrinsic nature, svabhava. And as it turns out, even the Buddha himself doesn't have svabhava. And what makes the Buddha the Buddha? The fact that they know that about themselves so thoroughly, and have, in virtue of that knowledge, completely uprooted all of the habitual tendencies that have caused them to remain agitated and bound to a cyclic existence. Okay, so I've gone through the handout a bit quickly, and so I'm going to wrap the lecture up in short order. And again, we'll take some time at the beginning of next class to address any questions that you might have about this part of the reading. And all I want to do in the meantime is encourage you to be in touch with me if you have need to discuss this material before we meet on Thursday of this week. And let me close again by thanking you for your patience. I'm sorry that I was unable to be in class today. And I look forward to seeing all of you on Thursday afternoon. I should be in my office for office hours on Thursday. I land in Toronto at 9 a.m. that morning. So I plan to go directly to my office from there, and I should be able to get there on time. If I'm a little late, please forgive me. I'll be there as soon as I'm able. And I think that's all for now. So we'll see you all the day after tomorrow. Okay, bye-bye.